is this reform aspiration just gaining momentum, or is it losing momentum?
It's definitely losing momentum. Let me step back. I'm a little older than you. I grew up in the Cold War era. So when I say I feel like I'm in 1989, in 2025, it's pretty clear to me, like it was in 1989, that the post-Cold War era now is over. But what's the next era? Is it multipolarity? I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Where are the poles? What does it look like? It's just messy, right? It's power politics, right? Is it great power competition? I thought that for the last 5 years, but China's not covering itself in glory, and the United States is abandoning everything that made it strong in the world and is breaking down the system. So what does the post-Cold War era look like? I don't know. In that environment, is the UN more or less important?
How then we could preserve the rules-based order, knowing that the UN reform would not happen anytime soon?
We are deeply anxious, but we're not the only country that is deeply anxious.
This is Eyes on Middle Powers, a podcast where we dive deep into the foreign policy updates of the middle powers, offering their perspectives on key issues shaping the regional and global affairs. This podcast is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia's Middle Power Studies Network.
Hi everyone, welcome to Eyes on Middle Powers podcast. Now I'm joined by Professor Gordon Flake, the CEO of Perth US Asia Center. Professor Gordon Flake, thank you for joining us.
It is my absolute delight, and thank you for spending the last 2 months here in Perth.
Yes, and so I've been a visiting fellow at Perth US Asia Center as well. Professor Gordon, could you tell us what have been your works for the past 2 decades?
I'm afraid it's a little bit more than 2 decades. I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C., working in the foreign policy think tank community there. And 12 years ago, I defected to the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C., which is here where we are today, Perth, Australia. I started out at a place called the Korea Economic Institute, where I was Director of Research and Academic Affairs in Washington. Then moved to the Atlantic Council, where I ran a program on conflict resolution, which was a euphemistic name for what was really just a North Korea project. And then I spent 15 years as head of the Mansfield Foundation, named after Mike Mansfield, who was a former U.S. Senator, Senate Majority Leader, and then Ambassador to Japan. So in other words, I spent 25 years as a professional think tanker. I tell people only somewhat jokingly that I've never had a real job in my life, and I'm keeping the streak alive in Western Australia because I was headhunted. I was recruited by an executive search firm to be the founding CEO, to build a brand new think tank here in Perth. And that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years, is building this institution that you've been part of recently, the Perth US Asia Center at the University of Western Australia.
Well, could you tell us what's special about Perth US Asia Center?
Look, for the classic model of a foreign policy think tank, Perth is the wrong place. As FPCI will know, normally the currency, the primary driver behind foreign policy think tanks are daily interactions with diplomats, government officials, and legislators who are involved in a nation's foreign policy, which is almost always set in a national capital. So a foreign policy think tank should be in Canberra, like it is in Jakarta or Washington, D.C., or Tokyo or Seoul or London. So why do we have a foreign policy think tank in a non-national capital in Perth? There are 2 basic reasons, or 2 basic assumptions behind our creation. Number one, we think that there is a critical mass, a sufficient number of global caliber strategic thinkers here in Perth that warrant a voice. We have 5 universities. We have a world-class private sector, primarily in the resources sector, but increasingly in other sectors as well, oil and gas, iron ore, agriculture, that are engaged. We have a state economy that is more integrated into the Indo-Pacific than it is to the rest of Australia. And as a result, political leaders on a local level, the state level, and the national level that are overwhelmingly foreign policy focused. And we have an elected class, a political class that has tremendous leaders. We have Stephen Smith, current High Commissioner in London, once defense minister, foreign minister. David Johnson, now head of our Defense and Security Institute here at the university, former defense minister. Linda Reynolds, former defense minister. Kim Beasley, who's the chair of our board, former leader of the opposition, former defense minister. The current leader, the current member for Brand down south, who's our Minister for Resources, Madeline King, is a former COO of the center. The Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, former Shadow Minister for Defense, Andrew Hastie. So if you live in WA, you tend to think foreign policy. So we need to feed that community, and that community needs, an institution. Hence, we have that. The second reason we exist is because perspectives from Perth are different than perspectives from Canberra or even other nearby cities like Melbourne or Sydney. And so we think it's important to give voice to WA perspectives on the Indo-Pacific. So in a nutshell, we are Australia's Indian Ocean capital. We are closer to Bali than we are to Adelaide. We're closer to Jakarta than we are to Canberra. We're closer to Singapore than we are to Sydney. And as a result, we want to share our views on a national level, and we want to make our national policy making more rich. And that's kind of what we've been doing.
Well, that's a great work the center has been doing. I've been experiencing it firsthand. A clear purpose, strong foundation. Professor, I want to start with a big question. How do you see Australia position itself in the world?
There is a phrase that Australians often use about themselves and that other countries also use about Australia, and it's called punching above its weight. And it's a boxing analogy, which means that we tend to have a lot more influence than we rightly might expect. We have a population of just 27 million people, smaller than Jakarta.
At 0 and to 70 million.
Yeah. So we're very small in that regard. We have a large land mass, but in terms of the size of our economy, the size of our population, we are not what you would consider to be a major power. But we have a treaty alliance with the United States. We are world-class multilateralists. So whether it's the United Nations or almost any other multilateral initiative, we're going to be very proactive involved. And we're going to be deeply engaged in our region. So whether it's with the East Asia Summit or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative or the G20 or the ASEAN Regional Forum, we're going to want to actively be involved in those things because we like to punch above our weight. We want to have more influence than our population, our economic heft might demand. So with that comes both tremendous opportunities, but also tremendous responsibilities. And there are certain risks involved too, right? Because, what we don't want to do is we don't want to live in a world where economic size or population size or military might alone determine our destiny. We want to live in a world that has a international law, what we would Australia call a rules-based order, because we don't want a world where might makes right. The old Greek philosopher Thucydides said, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. We don't like that. We don't want might makes right. We want us to be able to work together with other partners like Indonesia, but also with treaty allies like the United States, important partners like Japan or Europe or the UK or increasingly India, to make sure that we have maximum flexibility in the world despite our relative size.
Well, you mentioned Australia wants to advocate for this rules-based order. Then how do you view the current situation that what people have been saying, the old world order is dying, the new one is not yet born, and so on, and where Australia fits into this transition?
We are deeply anxious, but we're not the only country that is deeply anxious. For the better part of 20 years, particularly the last 15, not the rise of China. The rise of China is something over 30 years that collectively, Indonesia, Australia, the US, Europe, we not only welcome, we helped facilitate, right? Because we wanted it. We wanted the economic growth of China. So I'm not talking about the growth of China, but over the last decade plus, the way China has leveraged its power and influence globally, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific, hasn't been as favorable as we would like to a rules-based order. They do not want their relative power to be constrained. They like to think of themselves as a great power. And there was a very memorable moment back in 2017 when Yang Jiechi, the then Chinese foreign minister, did the equivalent of Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table and basically said, China is a big country. You are small countries. So they want a world in which China's greatness is acknowledged and respected. And that's not necessarily good for us, right? We want a country where we're not all at parity, but that we have equal respect as nation states despite our size. And so whether you're the Philippines or Vietnam or Indonesia with the Natuna Seas or other claimants in that, or if you're Taiwan or if you are countries in the Baltic states, who have been on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion, or if you're Australia, and we went through 3 years on the receiving end of economic coercion from China, or South Korea is seeing the same thing. We don't want that kind of world, right? But that is a major trend. China is increasingly, to use the expression, throwing their weight around to get, not through diplomacy, but through economic coercion and other types of coercion, their will that is not what we would consider to be rules-based. So that's one trend, which has been happening for 15 years, and every country in the region knows it and has experienced it. And at the same time, much of the post-World War II rules-based order was built on a foundation of American-provided security. So, I applaud what ASEAN has accomplished, but ASEAN itself was built on that foundation. The UN was built on that foundation. The rules-based order was built on that foundation. And right now, the United States' relative reliability as a provider of global commons, as a provider of global security, is questioned. And that really impacts a country like Australia that is a treaty ally of the United States. And so we have anxiety, not just about China, but increasingly about China's willingness to partner overtly, without limitations, with countries like Russia that have violated other nations' sovereignty and attacked a sovereign country, and North Korea, a classic rogue state in the international system, and increasingly Iran. And that partnership is concerning. And now we have the United States decreasing reliability in NATO, in treaty alliances with others. And so we're anxious. And in that environment, we are understandably looking for efforts to strengthen our relationship with the United States and hopefully, lock the United States into a more supportive role, but at the same time, dramatically expanding our relations with other like-minded countries. And so you'll see today, Australia's relations with Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, India, Canada, the UK, Germany, Sweden, I can keep going on and on. Those relations are the best they have ever been. Why? Because we have shared interests. Because we have a shared concern about the uncertain international environment in which we currently find ourselves.
How big is the appetite among the policymakers in Australia that it wants to seek for greater autonomy from the US, although strengthening the relations with the US still remains a cornerstone?
I don't know that Australians would frame it that way. Because I don't know that Australian security planners, not all of them at least, would think of us as having sacrificed our autonomy by having an alliance with the United States, right? Again, there are some. But there are some on the side of the spectrum that see if we join the AUKUS submarine deal that we have given up our autonomy, our freedom, our independence, or our sovereignty. My view is, how does a country like Australia with a relatively small population, a very long coastline, and an uncertain world and region in which it lives, how do we guarantee our autonomy? Well, we do so with two main strategies: reliance on the rules-based order and reliance on an alliance relationship with the United States. And so I still believe, and again, I fundamental biases because I'm still an American citizen, even though I'm an Australian citizen at the same time. I have a bias, but I still believe that Australia's autonomy is enhanced by its relationship with the United States. Australia's sovereignty and its capability to move in this world is enhanced by an alliance with the United States. So all you have to do is ask the question, 4 years ago, when China was really upset at us about calling for a COVID investigation, for demanding a cessation of Chinese intervention into our politics and our education system, in our media, and blocking Chinese investment into secure, communications and other infrastructure. When we pushed back on that, China began to block imports of coal, of crayfish, of barley, of wine, of meat, and there was real economic punishment, coercion placed against us. If we did not have the treaty alliance with the United States, would our response have been different? Would we have more autonomy or less autonomy? And that actually is true of Australia's relationship with everywhere else, is our autonomy. So there are risks, what you might call entrapment, particularly when the United States has not been the country that we have long hoped it would be and long anticipated it would be. But those are relatively small, in my view, compared to the lack of autonomy we would have without that backing from an alliance partner across the seas.
How is Australia then navigating its relations with China, zooming into the bilateral relations, knowing the economic reliance is heavy and so on and so on?
Oh, look, this is bigger than domestic politics, but there are differences in different domestic politics in Australia. So under the previous government of the more conservative parties in Australia, and in Australia, the conservatives are called the Liberals. Yep. So that gets confusing for people, right? But the Liberal National Coalition, the coalition government, was quite overtly skeptical of China, and relations were quite negative during that period of time. Now, to be fair, the primary driver in that was China, right? They were the ones who were exerting pressure on us, and so it was a natural sovereign response by our government at the time to respond to it. The Labour government has come in and has pursued a much more conciliatory policy, and that has led many people to assume that Australia has pursued a policy of I wouldn't call it appeasement, but they say Australia has had a thaw in its relations with China. And my analogy is that this is not the right temperature-related analogy. We have not given in to any of China's demands. At one point, in 5 years ago, the Chinese ambassador in Canberra had leaked a 14-point demands of things that Australia had to do if they wanted to improve their relations with Australia. One of them is closing down the fellow think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, allowing Chinese investment to all of our sectors, not blocking Chinese intervention in schools and in our media and in our politics, not calling for a COVID investigation, etc. Australia hasn't given in to any of those things. We haven't thawed the relationships. The problems in Australia-China relations haven't gone away. Instead, my view, and I said it's a different temperature analogy, under the current government, they've just reduced the temperature. We're not inflaming them anymore. We're not poking them in the eye. And so we've returned to some degree of normalcy in terms of our politics, with our prime minister visiting China, with the Chinese premier visiting here. And so there's some degree of normalcy, but the problems haven't gone away. The fundamental thing. So while that's happening, we're also pursuing these close security relationships with Japan. We're building up our own defense capability. We're moving forward with AUKUS. So, we're not back to the way things were, but that gives you a better sense for how we're dealing with this thing, because we have a challenge that is shared by most countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, is that we have, a reliance upon China as our number one trade partner. And yet we also rely upon the United States as the number one provider of global goods, security, alliance, and kind of the international norm in which we base. And so there's a tension there.
In Middle Power Studies Network at FPCI, we believe that middle powers have the most effective role in their own immediate region. Indonesia shaping regional architecture in Southeast Asia by pioneering initiatives in ASEAN. And then we can see Germany, France in Europe, and so on and so on. Kazakhstan starting to do something in Central Asia, but I can't seem to find the exact obvious answer of Australia and which immediate region it has been eyeing onto to play a bigger role.
So I don't want to disagree with Pacdino, but I'm going to disagree with Pacdino, right? I actually think that middle powers have more influence outside the region than their intermediate region. And this is what I mean by that. I had done a series of research papers early on MICTA. MICTA is Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia. And what it is an informal grouping within the G20, which is not the BRICS countries and it's not the G7, but it's the other countries, right? And the interesting thing, if you compare those countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia, every one of them, is a sizable economy, very similar sizes of economy. And any one of those countries, if we put it in the middle of Europe, we would be a consequential country. We would be big. If you put Indonesia's population and the size of the economy in the middle of Europe, it would be one of the leaders of Europe. If you put it in South America, it would be a leader in South America. And yet Indonesia is ironic. It's because of the ASEAN way and ASEAN centrality and the consensus-based approach of Australia in ASEAN, Indonesia candidly has the same vote as Laos. And so Indonesia globally has the potential to have a bigger role than it does within ASEAN, given the constraints of ASEAN. Korea is stuck between Japan and China, so it's more influential globally than it is in Northeast Asia. Australia is kind of the odd party out in this region. So we're in the Indo-Pacific, but we're not formally a member of ASEAN, nor are we considered part of this region writ large. Our relationship with the South Pacific states are kind of different. So we have a global role, not just a regional role. We're bigger than Oceania, right? If that makes sense. Similarly, Turkey is stuck between Europe and the Islamic world. And so they have a role to play. And Mexico, is obviously completely overwhelmed by its proximity to the United States. And so one of the things I wrote repeatedly about collective action between these 5 countries, if we can agree upon something, we can move the global dial on these issues. Now, obviously, every one of them does have regional influence, but now we can get into it in a minute. But I'm not a big fan of the construct of middle power anyway. I'm much more of a fan of us as consequential states that leverage in different areas our influence globally.
Why hasn't MICTA done anything substantive, if I may say it that way? It seems to us that it lacks common purpose.
Yeah. It comes down to politics and the leadership of different countries. First and foremost, Turkey has been a bit problematic, right? Just because of its own internal issues and a lack of common cause with others under Erdogan. And then in Korea has very famous pendulum politics. And so you'll have times when the Korean government likes it and supports it, and there are times when they ignore it. Similar is true with Indonesia. There are times when Indonesia is hot. There's times when Indonesia cold. So it still exists, but I'm still okay with it. I don't think it needs to be an institution. It doesn't need to solve anything. We at the Perth U.S. Asia Center, after writing early on in 2014, 2015, several MICTA reports, most recently, probably in 2022 or so, one of my colleagues wrote a report recommending that Australia pull out of MICTA because it doesn't do anything, which I felt deeply personally about. In the end, my view is that every country, Indonesia and Australia included, we have a lot of tools that we use for different things. And so if I'm Indonesia, I will use ASEAN for some things, but not everything. I will use the G20 for some things, but not everything. If I'm Australia, I'll use the G20 for some things and the UN for some things, but I'll also use AUKUS for other things. I'll use the Quad for other things. And there's lots of different agreements. And so MICTA is just one more tool. It's not going to solve everything and do everything, but it's one more tool for the appropriate issue in the appropriate time.
I think I would need to put it out there, just tracing back again to your point on Indonesia and ASEAN. I think many would agree that Indonesia on the global stage without ASEAN as its asset won't be the Indonesia that it is today on the global stage. And the other way around, ASEAN without Indonesia wouldn't be the same. And we think that is inseparable of our diplomatic weight on the global stage. But now I also want to zoom into Australia-Indonesia relations, because we do feel that middle power to middle power relations, be it sporadically, not in groupings, bilaterally or trilaterally, can be effective as well. How do you view Australia and Indonesia as an example of, in your word, consequential power to consequential power relation cooperation?
And here this is semantics, but I don't think I have ever heard an Australian describe Australia-Indonesia relations as middle power to middle power relations. Again, I don't think I've ever heard an Australian say the relationship with Indonesia is middle power to middle power. Because the thing is, number one, Indonesia and Australia are the closest neighbors. We're both in the G20. We've got a lot of areas of close cooperation and security and regional thing. Where you do have a point, however, and where we need to be doing more is what should Australia and Indonesia be doing together in the region? And I would say, what should Australia and Indonesia be doing together globally? And once we talk about that, we're doing more than just bilateral, right? Because of the nature of ASEAN, which you very eloquently defended, that is in some ways a limiting factor, right? Because why would we work just with Indonesia, if Indonesia is going to insist it has to be with ASEAN, right? Which is why I think the MICTA agenda is interesting, because we're talking about working with Indonesia globally, not just in ASEAN. And personally, my view is that, I, no question, think that I understand the Indonesian foreign policy is based on ASEAN centrality, and Indonesia says that. But the truth is, Indonesia is not just a member of ASEAN. Indonesia is already 280 million people, soon to be 290 billion people. And even if you don't believe the long-standing PwC estimates that by 2050, Indonesia will be the fourth largest economy in the world, and it falls short, it will be the fifth or the sixth. It will be a top 10 economy in the world. And in that context, I think that Indonesia has responsibilities that are global, that are not just ASEAN, in which Indonesia has an independent role. But that's just my opinion. You obviously have the latitude to pick or choose as you will.
Well, we actually received the similar views on why we disagree on the term middle power and so on and so on. Some also say the same thing, that we should aim for global influence and so on. But in FPCI, we thought the term middle power is not limiting. The intention is to encourage this group of countries could punch above their weight and play global influence. And so that might be where some people would catch wrong of our intention.
So the only thing I push back on that
middle power
is that's fine on certain issues and in certain fora, but you do not want to limit yourself to working with middle powers.
Yeah.
That's just one tool for a certain set of issues.
That's right.
And the truth is right now, most of the world and most of the world's great powers are clamoring to work with Indonesia. Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
So
Indonesia-Australia relations as a best practice in the world yet?
Unfortunately not. I think that vision is spectacular. I agree with it. I'd love to see it work together. So I'd love to see Australia and Indonesia working together things over the years. And we've found out that unfortunately, the level of investment bilaterally between Australia and Indonesia is the lowest level of investment between any two riparian G20 states in the world, right? So we should be the model, but we're not. In other words, Australia needs to prioritize Indonesia more. Indonesia needs to prioritize Australia more. So to use your framing, I think Indonesia needs to look south and find itself a willing partner in Australia. And I'm encouraged the fact that, our prime minister was going to be one of the first ones that's going to call Jokowi, and that his first visit is going to be to Indonesia. That's going to become the new trend. That shows you how close they are. The fact that your president and our deputy prime minister have these close relations from the time they're both defense ministers, and our defense and security relationships are close, are good. But I wouldn't call it a model yet. In fact, if you're looking broadly, Indonesia, Korea, and Australia, Korea, those two bilateral relationships are both stronger than Australia, Indonesia right now. So we've got a ways to go, but the vision is good.
Would you say that the China factor, the way we view China, the way we handle China, is the invisible wall between Indonesia and Australia and countries alike?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Indonesia is often classified as a global swing state because it is contested ground, right? And China has a lot of influence in Indonesia, and Indonesia has made a number of decisions over the last decade, including buying fully into Chinese technology in Huawei and your communications and increasingly transportation, other things that are going to be interesting for Indonesia in the future in terms of the challenges that they pose, right? And those will lead to some limitations as the world has growing concern about technology and advanced communications, etc. But in general, I don't think that anybody thinks that the relationship with China and Indonesia is an impediment to relationship between Australia and Indonesia. The bigger thing is that our two economies are more competitive than they are complementary, and we both of us look north, right? Indonesia tends to look to Korea and Japan, Europe and the United States, and Australia tends to look to Korea and Japan, China, the United States, the same way you do. We don't look, Indonesia looks south, and we don't look to our near north as much as we should. And again, I will state, our relationship is probably the best it has ever been right now. And it has improved dramatically. But if you compare it with the potential, and to where it is right now, we still have a lot of work to do.
There is something that we cannot do because we view the risk perception in the region differently. That has to do with our defense cooperation, security cooperation, and so on and so on. What would you say we cannot do and we can do that we already know?
Interesting question. Whether it is our talisman saver exercises or pitch black exercises, again, the level of cooperation and communication between the TNI or the armed forces more broadly of Indonesia and Australia is very, very close. And in fact, it's not widely understood by the Indonesian people how close that security relationship is. So again, I'm hesitant to say that is fundamentally a barrier between cooperation here. But Indonesia is a country who has made the decision to operate within this region primarily through ASEAN, and as a result is not actively soliciting more Australian involvement in the region, nor is Australia looking forward to either. The interesting thing will be obviously if there are changes to the security environment, right? So, Indonesia is not immediately a climate change state to what's happening in the South China Seas. So if you look at the Philippines today, the Philippines literally every single day are under very tough pressure, from China and the Chinese military and the Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese Navy, around their sovereign waters, right? Which China claims. The Philippines cannot turn to ASEAN for that. And the Philippines don't turn to Indonesia, which is a closer neighbor to the Philippines for that, because they have little expectations of help from either ASEAN or Indonesia. So instead, the Philippines have turned to Japan, the United States, and Australia in what's called the Southeast Asian Quad, to support them in that area. Now they have a treaty alliance with the United States. That's different. Indonesia, of course, had the situation with the Natuna Seas gotten worse, it would be interesting to see what Indonesia did, right? Because even in that environment, Indonesia couldn't turn to ASEAN because ASEAN is divided on this, right? With Laos and Cambodia and others, ASEAN cannot speak with one voice on this current security issue in the South China Seas. And mercifully right now, Indonesia has been pretty strong on that. The Chinese seem to have backed off on that, but I'm not sure that it's gone. And one of the questions Indonesia might ask itself is that if the Philippines fail to protect their claims, does that make the situation for Indonesia better or worse? Yeah. And in that case, who does Indonesia turn to, right? So,
what would you explain about the situation where in the world currently, Southeast Asia is the place where there is no direct conflict happening, when Europe is obviously, we got the invasion of Ukraine, and then we also have in the Middle East a lot of conflicts.
Well,
in Southeast Asia, apparently, with the norms and the culture that we have built in Southeast Asia, there is no conflict at the moment.
Well, you could say that 6 months ago. You can't say that now. Lives lost in the Cambodia, Thailand border, and really close to a serious conflict. And so, I don't know. On the one hand, ASEAN has been so successful for decades now because ASEAN almost like a religion, almost an ideology. ASEAN centrality, ASEAN unanimity, a consultative, consensus-based approach has done a really good job of knitting together, all these nation states who are quite different in terms of geography, in terms of economies, in terms of religion in some cases. And it's done a really good job of that, right? And ASEAN has done a really good job at internal integration, slowly, carefully. ASEAN has not done a very good job at leadership. I don't know that ASEAN has done a really good job at responding to external threats. Obviously, the South China Seas is one of those. I don't know that you would hold up the ASEAN is a great success if you're the Philippines today. Do you think, if you're the Philippines today, do you think ASEAN has been great success at protecting you as a member of ASEAN? Probably not, right? And then the very recent conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, where lives were lost and there was serious military conflict. On the one hand, that is a failure of ASEAN. There's no question, right? That the long-standing investment didn't stop this from happening. Part of that is just personalities in Thailand and personalities in there. The other hand is the at least temporary resolution of that is an indication that ASEAN does still have influence. The other ASEAN leaders came in and did. The interesting thing was, in the at least temporary resolution of this issue, or the reduction in the temperature around this issue, it wasn't ASEAN institutionally that did it. It was other neighboring states, right, who had played a role in that process. And so it's going to be one of those issues. And so I don't know that I would say it. Now, look, you say, compared to Europe, right? We had, 70 years of peace in Europe where despite the Cold War, it was a peaceful region. And today you can no longer say that there is no war in post-war Europe, right? Because there's a war in the middle of Europe with what's going on in Ukraine. That is a big issue, to be honest, that I think every member state of the UN should be wrestling with, including Indonesia. Because what has happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not explainable any other way. It is a gross violation of sovereignty. It is a gross violation of national borders. And I find nation states that explain that away that is bad precedent for the world in which we live, right? Now, obviously, the Middle East is a different story altogether. I won't go to that, Kish.
Yeah, I agree that the point on what you said is ASEAN not institutionally handling it, but there's a management being done at the leadership's level. Maybe not ASEAN as an institution, but there is this management culture, which might be just risk reduction, but not solving the conflicts. But I want to go to conflicts, views on conflicts now. How does Australia view the conflicts that are happening at the moment? We have, of course, invasion of Ukraine, but also Gaza and the Palestine-Israel conflict.
So on Ukraine, Australia has been pretty unequivocal in condemnation of Russia's actions and support for Ukraine. There are people within Australia that think that Australia could do more and should do more, right? But still, relatively, for a country that is a long ways away from Europe and a long ways away from Ukraine, I think probably Australia has been one of the most ardent and full-throated supporters of the Ukrainian people, and you see that quite regularly, right? So again, I personally would like to see us do more, but compared to others within our region, we're an outlier in that front, right? With the possible exception of Japan, right? Who again views this on a strategic level. And that partly goes back to what we're talking about earlier, right? If you believe in the rules-based order and one country wantonly violates the sovereignty of another country and invades it with the stated intent of eliminating that country, that's a problem. And if that is allowed to happen there, what does it mean for our region? What does it mean for Taiwan? What does it mean for the South China Seas? It means that we are accepting might makes right. And that's not good for anybody. And so I think it's a slippery slope. We have to resist it by principle, and they've done that very well. The Middle East is much more complex. And you see it's very complex playing out in Australian politics today. Because as a country, Australia is probably more progressive and almost European in their views. And so you will see pretty broad spread support for the Palestinian people in Gaza. So just this last month, there were 80,000, 100,000, maybe more Australians marching across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of the people of Gaza. That is not the same as condemnation of Israel, because I personally, and I think many Australians, can hold both thoughts at the same time. We can condemn Hamas. We can condemn the worst catastrophic murder of Israeli citizens since the Holocaust on the one hand, right? And at the same time also condemn what's happening to the people in Gaza, right? They're both things that can be condemned, but there's a complexity there that is both generational and very, very deep. So this interesting right now is a very difficult issue for Australia. Our government has come out and made it clear that in the next UN General Assembly, they will vote for the diplomatic recognition of Palestine. And that has raised the ire of Israel. So we've had the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I've almost a personalized fight with our prime minister. It's playing in our politics too. So the conservative side of our politics now are critical, and again, there's a fine line between encouraging anti-Semitism and at the same time being humanitarian. And I think as humans, we should be able to call a spade on both sides. And I don't know that it's helpful for us to align one side versus the other. I think we can say we respect Israel. We know their unique history and the history of the globe and the unique challenges they face in the region, and also condemn Benjamin Netanyahu for his anti-democratic tendencies and for the excesses they're doing in Gaza, while at the same time recognizing the very real threat they feel. We can condemn Hamas and condemn the excesses of what is now functionally within Gaza, the Palestinian leadership, and at the same time decry the horrors that are being wrought upon the Palestinian people and their starvation. And you'll find that it is difficult to find people who are willing to do both. And you have to do both, I think, in my view. And Australia is kind of caught in the middle of that.
Is the hope for middle powers to be involved in peace efforts in the future? That always goes back to the UNSC and stuff like that. And the reform agenda seems not moving forward as much as we want. And how then we could preserve the rules-based order, knowing that the UN reform would not happen anytime soon?
Yeah, so you really put your finger on the fundamental challenge, right? And so this is why I said earlier, something like MICTA, or even the construct of middle powers, it is not a tool that you use for every occasion. I mean, there's so much that Indonesia can do bilaterally. There's a lot that Indonesia can do through ASEAN. There's a lot that Indonesia can do through MICTA, or that it can do through the East Asia Summit, or that it can do through the G20. And there's other things that it can do internationally, other things it can do in partnership with Australia bilaterally. There's just lots of different things. And so I don't know that peace and security wise, that is, the primary vehicle that you're going to use to solve issues, right? Now, what I do think is interesting is that if you can get the middle powers to agree upon something, that has a moral weight that can help shift the debate. So interestingly, and again, I don't have a strong opinion on this or sufficient knowledge to have a strong opinion on this, but as an observer, I find obviously decisions by France and others in Europe on the recognition of Palestine, and Australia has been willing to join them on that. And again, you don't normally think of France as a middle power, but candidly, France and Canada and Australia probably are, just different degrees. Collectively, in an era where the US and what China they're doing are very, very politicized, that has weight. That's helpful. Does it mean that we directly are able to intervene in a conflict? Probably not. But we have moral weight in terms of shifting the global debate on an issue, which is why, to be honest, if you look at the middle powers, I'm disappointed that the middle powers have not been more overt in their condemnation of Russian actions in Ukraine. And I would say at the same time, more overt in their condemnation of Chinese support for Russia in Ukraine, which is unacceptable, right? I mean, it really is. If you're a country like Indonesia that is deeply sensitive about sovereignty and national sovereignty, to witness that and not come out against it clearly, and then not come out against countries that then support that. Yeah, there's a little bit of ambivalence there for me, right? So you can't talk about so if middle powers are capable at articulating and defending collectively principles, then you got to defend principles. And I think, again, there's few cases for me that are as cut and dry as what's happened in Ukraine. Not a lot of ambiguity around that one for me. Black and white.
Right.
So
Right. This might be the last two questions as well.
sure.
Still going back to the point on multilateral reform, UN reform, which I think the notion has been there for how many years, decades, and so on. But do you see any low-hanging fruits in the actual reform agenda? So we have the UN Pact for the Future, but it's just on paper that we haven't really tried to tailor. May I also add, you have been observing foreign policy for more than 20, just gaining momentum, or is it losing momentum, or is it just stagnant?
It's definitely losing momentum, right? So let me step back. I'm a little older than you. I grew up in the Cold War era. Mm-hmm. So I went through high school and most of my university days in the middle of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And we've had this conversation before. In 1989, I could not imagine the end of the Cold War. And pre-89, the UN was largely a international body fundamentally handicapped by the Cold War. There was a divide in the UN that stopped us from doing things, right? So today, I feel like I'm in 1989 again. And what I mean by that is, in 1989, I could not imagine an end to the Cold War because my whole life I had only known the Cold War, a world divided. And I saw perestroika in Glasnost, in Gorbachev in Russia, and then I saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all of a sudden I knew the world was changing, but I couldn't imagine what the world looked like. Mm. So why do I tell you that story? For the last 35 years, your entire lifetime, through most of my professional career, we've been in the post-Cold War era. And I love the post-Cold War era. It's about integration. It's about international cooperation. It's about globalization. We're all working together to solve problems like climate change and trafficking and a whole bunch of issues. Again, it's ultimately, about increased cooperation. And it was a good time. I think in history, we'll look back at this as a time when we wasted the opportunity to do so much better than we did. But my view is, when I say I feel like I'm in 1989, in 2025, it's pretty clear to me, like it was in 1989, that the post-Cold War era now is over. When did it end? Was Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014? Probably not. But Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Yeah. Was it Xi Jinping's first term and the kind of reversal of the reform trajectory of China? Probably not. Xi Jinping's unprecedented third term? Yeah, almost certainly. Donald Trump's election in 2016? Probably not. But certainly his re-election in 2024 means that era is over. I mean, the era, again, I loved it. I want to still stay there, but I don't think that's the world we live in right now. But what's the next era? Is it multipolarity? I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Where are the poles? What does it look like? It's just messy, right? It's power politics, right? Is it great power competition? I thought that for the last 5 years, but China's not covering itself in glory, and the United States is abandoning everything that made it strong in the world and is breaking down the system. So what does the post-Cold War era look like? I don't know. In that environment, is the UN more or less important? Yeah, less, right? I'm sorry, but when is the last time, after the first 6 months of the Trump administration, with tariffs flying here and there, the World Trade Organization being completely eviscerated, and even treaty allies having tariffs put against them, and threats to take over Greenland and war, and negotiations being done in Alaska, all of that done without even the slightest consideration of the UN. So is UN reform a thing? Or is that a something that happened in the post-Cold War era and that era is past? I don't know the answer to that, right? But I'm skeptical, right? I am more interested in things that are more akin to our era. So, can we do things to strengthen the G20? It's hard. Russia's in the G20, right? Okay, then what about the G7? Right, the G7 is limited. I think the G7 needs to be more representative. I'd like to see Korea, and I'd like to see Australia in the G7. In almost every respect, these two countries outperform Italy and Canada in the G7, and they need us. They need more Indo-Pacific voices. I don't know that Indonesia has that aspiration. Indonesia's expressed desire to join the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's a really good thing. That's a stepping stone that Korea used in their own development in terms of global rule. I would love to see Indonesia join the Trans-Pacific Partnership to try to rebuild something there, absent the U.S. leadership. But what I'm having a hard time seeing is whether it is Kyoto Protocols on climate or the World Trade Organization or the UN, the world global infrastructure is being robust at this point. In fact, so I love good former ministers and policymakers who put out proposals on how we can strengthen the UN, but those are swimming against the tide in a very different world today, and I'm saddened by that trajectory.
This is not part of the last question, but I just want to touch upon, you said G7, you have the aspiration of having Australia and South Korea. What I was wondering about is whether or not you would mention BRICS would add another countries that are part of Western country at all.
Yeah, no, good. And so that is actually true. So whether it's the G7, then the alternative to that is BRICS. And to be honest, what's happened in the last month alone is just mind-boggling to me, because after 30 years of enticing India, a vibrant democracy, to be more closely aligned with democratic societies around the world, it seems right now that Washington is pushing both South Africa, and India into the BRICS, where candidate India doesn't really want to be, right? But if they're not being respected or given the opportunity elsewhere, that is a different form of power. So again, I would prefer. I like your question. I'd prefer that we did things globally. It just seems that era may have at least temporarily passed us by. We have to rebuild it.
You mentioned it's not so clear if we say multipolarity and whatsoever. And in FPCI, we always vectorality, multinodality. There are lots of concepts there. But essentially what we are seeing is there's an a la carte movement by these consequential powers that punch above their weight to champion in their own issues and do alignments effectively in a la carte way. My question is, what would be this championing issue for Australia in the next probably a decade?
Wow, really good question. I don't know that there's a new issue that Australia would independently champion. I think what it would likely be is Australia working together with like-minded partners to both maintain and rebuild the rules-based order. So already, when it comes to international trade, Australia has almost unilaterally abandoned all tariffs, all restrictions on trade. We're one of the most free trading economies in the world. And so we have benefited from not only the World Trade Organization, but also the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, RCEP, and also the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. And we have worked together with Japan to hold that together, even when the U.S. pulled out. And we worked together with Japan and others to get the UK to join that. And now I'd like to see we work together with Japan and the UK to get South Korea and Indonesia to join the CPTPP to build something more. So I think really, if you look at it, what is Australia's interest? It's to hold on to whatever vestiges of the rules-based orders we can, and then rebuild it where we can while the world is going crazy. Because again, the alternative is a world dominated by power and by might, and that is not a positive future for Indonesia or for us or for FPCI.
You mentioned like-minded. Then how like-minded is Indonesia to Australia?
More than people realize. I think if you have a deeper understanding of Indonesia's aspirations in the globe, that there's more alignment than people in Australia or Indonesia understand, right? And part of that is just that we haven't had the strength of people-to-people relationships that we need. And part of it is that we need organizations like the Foreign Policy Community in Indonesia and the Perth US Asia Center to do a better job of identifying areas that we share common interests in, common values in, that we work together. Mm-hmm. Because again, I think we are more like-minded than you understand. It's just a matter of identifying that and building on that.
And probably that would be the question for our Indonesian audience, to turn the question around how like-minded Australia would be for Indonesia. But I would ask that too. Thank you very much for this insightful conversation, and see you in our next episode.
Thank you.